Good evening. Welcome to the second of ECA's spring webinar series. I'm Leslie Wharton. I'm co-chair of Elders Climate Action, and I am thrilled tonight to be able to introduce you to our guest speaker, Robbie Orvis. And let me start with the most important thing. Robbie is co-author of this very important policy book, Designing Climate Solutions. And he is here tonight to talk to us about some of the solutions that can help us effectively address climate change. Let me give you a little bit of his background before he starts. He's Director of Energy Policy Design at Energy Innovation, where he works on the firm's energy policy solutions and power sector transformation programs. For Energy Policy Solutions, he conducts analyses on which policies can most effectively help meet climate and energy goals, and he co-leads a project for the Chinese government to provide policy guidance for its climate strategy. Robbie is also a contributor to America's Power Plan, a project of the Power Sector Transformation Program that brings together expert thinking on policy solutions for clean, reliable, and affordable US power system. For this project, his focus is on wholesale electricity markets and energy efficiency policy. His research is on market designs and practices that help enable a high renewable energy future, particularly programs that unlock greater energy efficiency using performance-based regulation. He received his Master of Environmental Management from Yale University. And while at Yale, Robbie worked on a variety of energy issues, from utility rate decoupling to designing citywide energy efficiency policies. He also spent a summer consulting for the Housing Authority of the City of Milwaukee on energy efficiency programs. Stepping back further, from 2010 to 12, Robbie was a research analyst at the Environmental Integrity Project in Washington, D.C., where he researched regulatory monitoring and enforcement issues at power plants and refineries across the United States, and helped hold large polluters accountable for their emissions. Robbie graduated with honors from the University of California at Berkeley with a BS in Society and Environment. And between his junior and senior years, he interned at the Natural Resources Defense Council in DC, working to help pass the Cap and Trade Climate Bill in the House of Representatives. So you can hear he has a broad background and an enormous focus on the power sector, which generates most of our greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to turn it over to Robbie.
Thanks, Leslie. Really happy to be here and get a chance to speak with you all about some solutions to climate change. So I'm just going to jump right in and get going here. So I'd like to spend this time speaking with you all about kind of three big areas. First, I'd like to talk a bit about some of the newer climate trends. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with climate change and what's going on, but there's always a few points we like to hit when we're talking about climate change. Then I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about a 4-0 solution, focusing on the four sectors and countries, the big countries in particular, that are responsible for most carbon emissions. And then I'd like to spend a bit of time speaking about strategies for success, and that's taking what we're talking about today and trying to translate it into reducing emissions on the ground. So as many of you are aware, climate change causes weather extremes to become the new norm. And we've seen this across the US, in fact, across the world. Extreme weather is becoming the new normal. And climate change is worsening the droughts, wildfires, floods, storms, and other impacts that we've seen throughout history in the US, but these are all becoming much worse. And for example, some of the flooding, the terrible flooding in the Midwest over the past month is an example of this, as are the fires in the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest last summer. So we're really starting to see some of how climate change is making extreme weather become the norm. So just let me walk through what's going on here. So we can think of our weather as kind of falling across this normal distribution pattern, where we have about a third of summers that are colder than average, a third of summers that are about average, and a third of the summers that are hot. But what's happening is that since about the 1950s with climate change, back here, we're seeing that this trend is shifting, and now we have a trend where the new average is a much warmer temperature, and now we have extreme heat happening much more frequently than we were before. And the hot summers are now not only more than a third, they're 2/3 of all summers we're experiencing. So the impact of climate change is to cause this temperature trend to shift, meaning that most summers now are what were earlier considered just hot summers, and that we're getting those extreme hot summers much more frequently than we used to. Some of the impacts of this are this idea of runaway feedback loops. So when you get weather and climate changes, you start to unlock other types of warming that wouldn't happen but for these changes. So we're starting to see things like methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, about 28 times stronger than carbon dioxide, being released from all the melting tundra in the northern hemisphere. We're also seeing the shrinking of Arctic sea ice. So in this figure, you can see that since 1970, the extent of winter sea ice in the North Pole has shrunken dramatically. And this creates other problems like the albedo effect. So the albedo effect describes the fact that white things tend to reflect sunlight and dark things tend to absorb sunlight. And when you have less sea ice, you actually increase the absorption of the Earth's surface because it's not reflecting as much sunlight. And all of these things can cause climate change to actually get worse and become more intense over time, meaning it's very, very important to act early to prevent these things from happening. So another important fact here is that the Earth's atmosphere is kind of like a big bathtub. And there's a normal amount of carbon emissions that go into the atmosphere and a normal amount of carbon emissions that come out of the atmosphere through things like land uptake or ocean uptake. But as we put more and more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the drain of the tub is not able to remove those things fast enough from the atmosphere. And so even if we were to stop emissions today, we would still experience a rise in CO2 concentrations for quite a while. So consider this situation. Here's the business as usual. So if we don't do anything to stop our emissions, our CO2 concentrations are going to continue to rise through the next century. But as I mentioned, even if we stopped tomorrow, CO2 concentrations would slowly decline and then level out, but they wouldn't go down to zero. And if we do a middle road where we wait until 2050 to decarbonize, we continue to get that growth in CO2 concentrations through very close to the end of the century. So the longer we wait to take action on climate change, the harder it is to reduce emissions, because all of those cars and other things that went into the economy now also have to be taken out. And we're locking in higher CO2 concentrations for the foreseeable future. Okay, enough doom and gloom. Let's talk about what we can do to address these emissions. So we like to talk about a 4-0 solution. And that's to say that emissions are predominantly from the 4 main sectors of the economy: the power sector, the transportation sector, buildings, and industry or manufacturing. And in fact, actually, it's only about 20 countries are responsible for 3/4 of global emissions. So if we're able to win in those countries by targeting those 4 sectors I mentioned, we can make a huge dent in climate change and we can win. Of course, this takes policy. Technology is part of the solution, of course, and policy can drive technology. But it does take policy to help drive those technologies into the economy and to get those emissions reductions. So well-designed policies that are properly implemented can generate the necessary emissions reductions at speed and scale that we need to fight climate change. There are hundreds of policies that exist, but in practice, only about a dozen of them really work to drive down emissions. And this graphic is an excerpt from our book where we looked at what those top policies are and how they could collectively contribute to keeping the world on a 2-degree pathway. And one thing you can see is that with the different colors is that they come from all sectors of the economy. So there are 4 primary sectors, but we need policies in each of those sectors to really drive down emissions. Another thing is that not all policies cost the same. So on the right is something called a policy cost curve, but without getting into too much detail, what we're looking at are different policy options in the United States to address climate change. And the height of the bar below or above 0 tells us how expensive that policy is. And one thing that's immediately obvious is that there are a lot of policies that actually save money. And this is because things like energy efficiency standards that make your home more efficient or your car more efficient, they mean, when those things are implemented and they're strong, it means that you don't have to buy gasoline or electricity that you would otherwise have to buy. And so those policies can actually save money over time while also reducing emissions. Okay, I want to focus in particular on the transportation sector and the power sector, since those are the 2 biggest in the United States and the 2 sectors that have the most immediate potential for folks like all of you to get involved. So the first thing to decarbonize the transportation sector is to get more zero emissions vehicles on the road, things like battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid vehicles. These types of cars are dependent on batteries, and we've seen an incredible drop in the price of batteries over the last 20 years, and we're expected to see a continued drop in battery prices through 2030 and beyond. So these cars are very likely going to be the same cost as a conventional gasoline car within the next 5 to 10 years. But we really need to accelerate the pace at which these cars are purchased. So a common policy used here is something like a mandate. In California, there's a requirement to sell a certain number of electric vehicles by a certain year. And this can be done through incentives and other programs to encourage people to drive those types of cars. But we also need the infrastructure that goes with those, like charging stations. Another very important policy for the transportation sector are fuel efficiency or tailpipe emission standards. These types of policies specify either the miles per gallon or the CO2 per mile driven that these types of cars are allowed to emit. Many countries, many of the leading largest emitting countries in the world have fuel efficiency standards. You can see the United States on here in the upper right at 55 miles per gallon, though the Trump administration has stated its intent to reduce that standard, even though, as you can see, other countries are achieving an even greater standard, or at least close to the standard that the United States is achieving. And these types of standards are important because they keep emissions lower than they would otherwise be for all of those gasoline cars that, even with a lot of electric vehicles, are still going to be purchased in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And they also allow for a bit of flexibility so that if I'm a vehicle manufacturer, I can actually sell an electric vehicle and I get a big credit under this program. So fuel standards in the United States, they're called corporate average fuel economy standards, or CAFE standards, are a big part of the picture for the transportation sector. And of course, another part of decarbonizing transportation is expanded public transit options. So the only way you get people out of their cars is if they have good options for getting to places that don't require taking an expensive Uber or a Lyft or a cab. We really need better options where it's the preferred choice for people to take those options to travel around. So this is an example on the screen of something called bus rapid transit. And bus rapid transit is kind of an intermediate step between having a bus system and having a metro system, where you have dedicated bus lanes that allow people to get to and from points of interest very quickly. These are of growing use, especially in the developing world, and cities like San Francisco has a big program now to install several of these throughout the city. So we need more and better public transit options to get people out of cars and onto more efficient transportation modes. So in total, this is another excerpt from the book. We found that these types of transportation policies can reduce emissions by close to 10% globally, though it's worth noting that in the US, transportation is actually a much larger share of emissions. So this number would be double this or triple this in the US. The other sector I want to focus on is the power sector. So Leslie told you a bit about my background in the power sector. And there's an incredible transformation happening right now. So for years, we've relied on coal and gas and nuclear, and not so much wind and solar. But wind and solar are experiencing an incredible price drop now. So this graph shows you the price of solar panels over the last 10 or so years. And in that time, the price has come down by nearly 90%. And as a result, we've seen growing shares of renewables, of solar in the power sector. A similar story can be told for wind. Wind has been around for a bit longer than solar, so the price decline now is not as extreme, but even still, the price has come down by over half over the last 10 years. And a similar story is unfolding for offshore wind. So offshore wind is in its very early stages, but what developers are finding is that they're able to make these projects very profitable and at lower costs every year that they build new projects. So offshore wind is expected to fall in price a lot in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Renewables are now so cheap that they're actually cheaper to build and run than to continue operating existing plants. So what this figure is showing, this is a recent study we published. All the red circles are power plants where it is cheaper to go out, build a new solar plant, and run it than it is just to pay to continue operating coal plants in these areas. And what you can see is that in a lot of the country, it's actually cheaper to just get rid of the old coal and replace it with solar than it is to continue running it. And these costs are expected to continue to fall over time. The other thing, of course, is to use electricity more efficiently. And in particular, we think about this in buildings. So the technology available today is really incredible. There's something called low emissivity windows. And what these are windows for commercial buildings, for example, that dramatically reduce the amount of heat that buildings absorb. And when that happens, we can spend less money on cooling. So for example, these types of windows are able to reduce the heat that buildings absorb by up to 50% or more. There's also been a revolution in lighting. So many of you are probably familiar with incandescent and CFL and LED light bulbs, but the cost reduction for LEDs is really incredible. It's on the right side of this figure here. And you can see that the cost has just absolutely plummeted over the last 10 years and expected to continue to fall. And these types of light bulbs are much more efficient than incandescent light bulbs. They also last a lot longer. Incandescent light bulbs last 2 to 3 years. CFLs might last 7 to 9 years. LEDs can last 15 or 20 years. Imagine not having to change the light bulb in your home for 20 years. It's kind of incredible to think about. And at the same time, we have more and more efficient appliances. And one of the interesting findings here is that we've actually been able to make appliances more efficient and to make them serve us better, for example, by having refrigerators that can store more, while the price has also fallen. So what you can see on this graph is that the volume of refrigerators has grown in blue, the energy use has fallen in red, and the price has also fallen. So it's somewhat of a myth that we have to pay more to have more efficient appliances. We can have more efficient, better appliances for less money. So again, this is from our book. These are just two of the major electricity sector policies and building sector policies. But we find that together, the electricity sector policies we talk about could reduce emissions by about 20% relative to what we need to get on track to a 2-degree warming scenario. Okay, so let's talk a bit about translating these policies and our options into achievable emissions reductions. So I want to focus here on the power sector for a minute. So the power sector is dictated in each state by something called a Public Utility Commission. And that is a group of commissioners. Sometimes they're elected, sometimes they're appointed, and they're responsible for deciding what the electric utilities get to build and what to charge people for. And if a utility comes to them and says, I want to build this coal power plant, they have the authority to say, yes, you can do that, or no, you can't. There's a Public Utility Commission in each state, and there's about 5 public utility commissioners on each commission. So that's 250 public utilities commissioners across the US. But you know, you only really need 3 of them to get a win on any decision. So right away, we can cut that number down to 30 states with 150 public utilities commissioners. And that's also because we can focus on the largest emitting states. So when you keep cutting this down to the states that matter the most, the states where you only need 3 commissioners to make a decision, that gets us down to 90 public utilities commissioners in the US. So in other words, there are 90 people in the US who have the decision-making authority as to whether or not we have a low carbon power sector or a high carbon power sector. And if we're able to influence those people, we can make a huge dent in emissions. So these types of commissions, they hold hearings, and we need people like you all, like other interested folks, to attend those hearings and to ask the hard questions and press those commissions to question the information they get from utilities. And so we need people who know the technological, economic, and political landscape, who can be serious about this type of effort. It's not an overnight thing, it takes time. But if you put in the time and the research in the background, you can flip a public utility commission from brown to green. And that's how we can make a difference in the power sector in the US. If we do this for utilities, we do it for cars and trucks, we do it for buildings, and we do it for industry, that's how we can get deep decarbonization of the US economy. So that's it for now, and maybe we can open it up to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Robbie. And I made a mistake at the beginning. Let me turn it over to Jen to just tell people how they can submit questions. I know some have already come in, and I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair, Jerry Friedman, and she is going to roll out the questions.
Hi, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. I definitely did. Let us know what your questions are. I've seen a number of questions come through the chat box, but if you could actually put them in the Q&A box, if you hover over your screen, you should see Q&A and a little icon with a Q in it on your screen. If you click on that, you'll see a way that you can type your questions directly into the question and answer box. It's just a lot easier for us to keep track of the questions, and then questions that maybe we don't get a chance to answer. We can see if Robbie has time to answer those offline, and we can send those out in a bulletin tomorrow. So enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to the ones that have already come through the chat also. So Jerry, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robbie. We do have several questions here. The first one is, are you contemplating using a different term than climate change? For example, climate crisis, climate chaos, or something else, or are you sticking with climate change?
Interesting question. I think because climate change is so familiar, and we got past using global warming to using climate change now, that's something that we use regularly. I think climate crisis is appropriate, but it's a good question, and something I'll actually have to think a bit about in our communications going forward.
Thank you. And also, do you interact with the people at Project Drawdown?
We've had a few exchanges with those folks, yes, although we see our work as somewhat complementary to theirs, and so we haven't worked closely with them on our relative research, but we are aware and have spoken on several occasions with some of the folks there.
Thank you. Another question. Jay Inslee has proposed banning internal combustion engines by 2030, much like Norway. Do you think this can happen given enough incentives and perhaps a cash for ICE clunker type program?
Anything's possible. I think that is a very ambitious goal. I would love to see it happen. It would require a big scale up of electric vehicle manufacturing, but it's the type of bold thinking we need to really get a hold on the climate crisis. And vehicles are something in particular where it's the earlier you can get out in front, the better, because people buy their cars and hold on to them, then other people will buy used cars. And so the sooner you can get people to buy those battery electric or those plug-in hybrid electric cars, you can turn over the stock of cars much faster. So I think anything's possible. I think it would take a lot of political will to get it done, but it's something I would love to see.
Do you think if we do not ban the internal combustion engine by 2030 or close to that, that we'll be able to meet our targets?
Well, it depends on which targets you're talking about, but the kind of overall principle is we need to electrify everything we can, and then we need to get all of the emissions out of the power sector. And so certain elements of that are easier than others. I think that it's the longer we wait to ban electric vehicles or to get people to see the benefits of buying electric vehicles, the longer it will take us to get all of those emissions out of the economy. And so I don't think it necessarily means that we won't hit our targets. The 2025 Paris target in particular is not that aggressive for the US, but if we're talking about deep decarbonization by 2050, where we're down to 25% or even lower relative to 2005, it will be hard to do that without something like banning gasoline vehicles by 2030 or 2035.
Thank you. We have a nuclear question. What's your evaluation of nuclear power as an alternative to fossil fuels?
So nuclear power, this is a question we get all the time. It's a very hot topic. Nuclear power has a definite role to play in decarbonizing not just the US economy, but the global economy. The problem is that it's incredibly expensive to build right now. I would love to see the small modular low cost reactors that a lot of folks have been saying should be developed in the next 5 to 10 years. It seems like we keep hearing that every 10 years and they don't emerge, but if we're able to build reactors that are low cost and low emissions, I think it's a great solution. For now though, we're not at the point where those exist, and the existing designs are very, very expensive and tend to be completely plagued by cost overruns. So because we have wind and solar that are so cheap right now, those are the things we should push hard on while also spending on research and development for nuclear.
Thank you. What can we elders do to further some of the policies that you're describing?
So I think, like I mentioned, attending some of these more, they're not sexy, but it's attending these public utility commission meetings or going and participating in local stakeholder processes. Sometimes no one goes to these events, and so a utility can kind of just get through whatever it wants to get through. So the more that folks can spend time on these actual regulatory and policy processes where they can make their voices heard and they can push back on certain things, the more impact that's going to have. And so I really do think it's about, you know, calling your congressman, going to the Public Utilities Commission meeting, going to your community meeting, fighting for better public transit options. That's one where there's often a lot of local feedback because people don't want a new bike share or a new bus or whatever it is in their community. So a lot of these things happen on the ground, and the more people we can get involved in these processes, the better chances we'll have of actually unlocking these low emission solutions.
Thank you. Robbie, if you wouldn't mind stopping the screen share so people could see you a little better, and then we have a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
What states are, when you're talking about the 30 states and the 90 commissioners that really hold a tremendous amount of power, do you define what states they are?
Well, they're the states with the most, they tend to be the most populous states, and the states with the most emissions. So, for example, if you look at where a lot of the coal power plants are in the country, they tend to be in the Midwest and the Southeast. So those are states where there are utilities coming in and making decisions about what to build, what to retire, and so on. And so my suggestion would be, I don't have a list in front of me, but if you look where the major emissions are, the electricity emissions, those are the states you want to target.
Where do carbon fees and rebates fit into your plan and your schedule?
So carbon fees and rebates are an important part of the solution. They are not a panacea. They will not completely reduce emissions on their own, but they do serve an important role in the industry sector and in the electricity sector. And of course, they can be a catalyst for raising revenue to spend on research and development, or to rebate or help offset some of the fees. So in our book, they are included, and they do drive a lot of emissions reductions in the book. But we think we can get the same or more emissions reductions from the more prescriptive policies, like things like building codes or appliance standards, that are also more likely to get passed. The problem is that carbon pricing, where it's been passed, really hasn't been strong enough. And so most of the emissions reductions, even in those countries or states, have come from other policies. So we tend to find that even where we get carbon pricing passed, it's not strong enough to drive deep reductions on its own. So that's kind of why I tend to think of it as a part of the solution and a complementary policy, but not the key driving policy behind deep reductions.
Thank you. So when you talk about building codes, those are regulated at a very local level.
Yep.
So that it implies that the work is not going to be done through any federal or state legislation. It's much more local, county, and municipal that are going to have to step up. And do you see that being able to happen given the number of individual municipalities and governments that there are?
So yeah, it depends on the state. So in California, for example, we have the Title 24 Building Code, which sets out the standards that builders have to meet. And then local municipalities are responsible for approving or denying permits and for doing inspections. So it's a bit of both. It can be a bit more challenging if the building codes are being developed at the local level, as you point out. But to my earlier point, that also means there's an opportunity for interested citizens to get involved and make their voices heard, and maybe even a bit easier than having to do it at the state or federal level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And then the local governments, counties, and cities and municipalities all have public hearings on regulatory changes that they make in terms of building codes.
Right, and it's not as interesting or as fun as some of the more, going to a divestment rally or going and protesting a pipeline, but it has more direct impact in the end. And it's where we really need more local citizen voices heard.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. How do you see your work complementary to Drawdown? I know you talked a little about it, but how do you see that meshing?
Yeah. So I think we have a lot of the same findings as Drawdown. Drawdown also covers some parts of the equation that we don't, like family planning, for example. So I think that Drawdown is a great a resource for those types of programs that we don't cover. I think the thing that we're super focused on is policy as the driver and not necessarily on technology. So a lot of other research that government does or think tanks do or is done in academia kind of says, well, if we get 10 million electric vehicles on the road, if we have 100 gigawatts of wind, then we'll get this emissions reduction. But we come at it a different way to say, okay, well, what kinds of policies do we need to get 10 million EVs on the road or to get 100 gigawatts of wind or solar? So the framing is a little different, even though the findings are actually quite in agreement. And so I think they're helpful that way to kind of balance out the kind of what's needed and how do we do it.
Thank you. We have a question here asking you to comment on 3 different things. I can read all of them to you, and then if you can try them one at a time.
Sure.
The first is the albedo enhancement, and then thorium reactor power plants, and green polyethylene, biogenic carbon sourced.
Okay. I have to confess that the second 2 I'm less familiar with. Albedo is about reflection, basically. So if you have light reflecting off of a white surface versus a dark surface, you can kind of picture, you know, you're out walking in the street, and if the sidewalk is really light and the sun's reflecting off of it, you might think, wow, I kind of need to put sunglasses on. But if you're on the pavement and you're walking and it's all black, you don't really have that effect. And at the same time, you probably notice that when you're walking on the pavement, the ground is a lot hotter. And that's the same thing that happens over the ocean and with ice. The ice reflects the sun, the light back out because it's light, white colored. And the ocean, which is from space, you know, a dark blue, almost a black, absorbs that heat. And so what happens is that when you lose the ice, you get more absorption by the dark ocean of that heat than would be reflected if it were covered with ice. Yeah. Thorium reactor, the latter 2 I'm less familiar with, but my general comment is that we have a lot of the technology today that we need to decarbonize the economy. We can get to 60, 70, 80% decarbonized power sector today just with batteries and wind and solar and other hydro and other technologies that we have. In transportation, we have electric cars that are getting cheaper and cheaper. And in 10 years, they should be even cheaper than buying a gasoline car. So we kind of are there today. And in buildings, there's a lot of municipalities that have net zero building standards. And in Europe, they have a lot of buildings that are extremely low energy requirement, something like 90% less than the typical building in the US. So we have a lot of the technology we need today to decarbonize the economy. That doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to do research and development on other technologies, but we need to make sure that while we're doing that research, we're deploying all of the stuff we have today to drive down emissions.
Thank you. Here's another question. How do you see the sense of emergency manifesting, and will the insurance industry have a role in promoting awareness?
That's a great question. The sense of urgency, I have to say, the last 2 years have been really incredible as we have an administration that doesn't believe in climate change and is trying to fight any policy to address it. We have this counteracting force of so many states now taking really bold action on climate. There's at least 4 states that have said they want to have net zero electricity emissions. It started in 2050, then 2045, then 2040. And it's like the states are trying to, each state is trying to outdo the other one to to reduce emissions. And you have a phenomenon where a lot of Democrats in Congress are now talking about really bold climate solutions. And that hasn't really happened in about 10 years. So I think there's a palpable increase in the urgency of the issue and the willingness and interest to take on some aggressive goals and targets and policy. So I'm really encouraged by that. I'm sorry, what was the second half of the question again?
The insurance industry having a role in promoting awareness.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's going to be in promoting awareness, but I do think that it's going to be increasingly difficult for industries that are exposed to lots of different elements of climate change, whether that's like the housing industry. I think if you want to get insurance on your house and you live in a coastal area, it's going to become increasingly difficult to do that. And other elements as well, like there's certain stocks or companies that are exposed to climate devaluation. So the oil companies recognize this. That's partly why they're investing in other uses of their products. And so I think, yes, the insurance industry will be part of this in all the ways that they offer products to different industries and sectors that are impacted by this. And I think one way you can track what's happening is to watch what happens to the insurance industry over the next 10 to 20 years as the damages build and the public reaction and policy space changes.
Great, thank you. What do you think about IFRS, fast reactors, as power and safety?
I am not familiar with IFRS.
Okay. I'm a retiree looking to do the precision intervention thing and follow your book. What advocacy organizations are best in class for transportation, building sector, power sector, and industrial? For each of the sectors, what are the advocacy organizations that are really best in class there?
That's another great question. And what I would love to do is get that list together and share it with you all so you can share it with everyone after this call.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we will share that. Given the split incentive problem, how can we influence owners of multi-unit apartment buildings to install car chargers?
It's a great question again. So that's a tough one. Partly what it's been, partly so far is that it's been mandated. And that might be in the short term what's needed is that if you're a multi-unit building owner and you want to do any kind of upgrade, you might be required to put in charging stations for folks. I think in particular, I have a plug-in car and I rent in a multi-unit building, and I can tell you it was very tough finding a building that either had it available or where the landowner was willing to install what we needed. And so I sympathize with that. I think what we are ultimately going to need is some kind of building code requirement at upgrade or at resale or something that requires building owners to put in those charging stations, and maybe some government incentive to help with that.
Thank you. A concern I would have without a government incentive is on the rental units that upgrade cost is passed on to the renters who may least be able to afford to cover those increased costs.
Yeah, there are some groups working on split incentive issues because they're not just confined to charging infrastructure, they're confined to anything related to efficiency. So one thing that I've seen, I think NRDC works on this, is something called a green lease, where the savings are split between the landowner and the tenant. But there are a lot of folks working on ways to try and capture that incentive and encourage the building owner to install those things that are more efficient. Building codes is one way to do it, but if you can make it profitable, you're able to unlock more potential that way.
Thank you. Do you work closely with the Big Greens?
Yes, we do. I would say the groups, the big climate organizations talk a lot with one another and share ideas with one another. We're all pointed in the same direction, but we come at it from a slightly different angle, and so each group kind of has its role. But it's a community of folks that are passionate and work with one another to get the best ideas to the right people.
Thank you. Industrial emissions policies and industrial efficiency policies are a huge 26% in your book, but it's harder for laymen to see how to influence their implementation. Where is the precision intervention pressure point for those two huge categories of policy?
I would say that those two are a bit harder. Those two need to be driven more by larger structural policy. Industry in particular is a very tough nut to crack globally. It's a huge source of emissions, and yet there's no really clear set of solutions to achieve deep decarbonization of the industry sector. But there are a few things you can do. One is that something that's often categorized in the industry sector are refrigerants that go into your air conditioner or your refrigerator that are very, very potent greenhouse gases. They have tens of thousands of times the effect of a single molecule of CO2. And so when you are done when your refrigerator breaks down or your air conditioner breaks down, you really want to make sure that gets recycled. You want to make sure that those things are getting checked periodically to make sure that if you have leaks of refrigerants, that it's not just leaking into the atmosphere. In the future, there will be more options to buy low global warming potential refrigerators and air conditioners. And you can also write to your congressman about the need to adopt something called the Kigali Amendment. So a couple of years ago, the UNFCCC agreed to an amendment to the Montreal Protocol. That's the thing that addresses the ozone hole, to ban these types of refrigerants that are really bad for the climate. And most countries have gone ahead and adopted that piece of policy called the Kigali Amendment. It has not been ratified in the US, and the EPA is currently looking at those chemicals but hasn't yet fully banned them. So one thing you could do is write to your congressman and say how important it is for the US to ratify the Kigali Amendment and address those refrigerant emissions, because that's actually a really big source globally of global warming gases.
Thank you. Bill McKibben has stated that we may be too late to avert climate disaster. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, every ton we emit is worse than the ton before. And so even if we're not able to hit a specific target that the scientific committee or someone draws in the sand, we should do everything we can to get rid of the next ton of emissions, because it only gets worse as we keep going. And we're very likely to see negative impacts. In fact, we're already seeing some impacts, as I mentioned at the beginning. But the important thing to remember is that it just keeps getting worse. So every ton avoided is a good thing. And so that should be our target. Avoid as much as we can, as fast as we can.
Thank you. Do you think carbon scrubbing can scale up cheaply enough to reduce the CO2 atmospheric concentration enough to help stabilize the climate?
I think it could be a complement over the long run, over the next, 50 plus years, to help us reverse what's out there. So I think the answer is yes. At today's cost, it's very expensive to do. But perhaps over time, if we have a carbon price or we're pushing the last few tons out of the rest of the economy, it may become a cost-effective way to get rid of some of those tons. And I know there's a lot of folks researching the technology right now to see how to bring it to scale and bring it down in cost. So I think it could serve an important role down the road after we've done as much as we can to reduce the emissions in the first place coming out of the economy.
Thank you. How do you see the financial communities? Are they strong change drivers or mostly just profiteering in the next 10 years?
Well, it's a bit of both. One really interesting thing is that a lot of banks have stopped investing in fossil extraction companies. There's a thread, this gentleman online, Justin Guai, every time a bank pulls out of funding a fossil fuel company, he writes about it, and what started off as a few posts is now this huge long thread of all these companies that are no longer funding. The counter to that is that there's often someone who's willing to step in and take on the risk and put more money into those businesses. And so my feeling is that the best way to address these things is through policies that affect demand. So let's cut the demand for gasoline, let's cut the demand for coal, because going after the suppliers is very, very hard. And if you make something more expensive for a global commodity like oil, that means that other companies where it was too expensive for them to extract oil, it now becomes profitable for them to do that. So it's very hard to come at things from the supply side by restricting supply. And the best way to do it is to reduce demand for those goods, because that's not prone to market dynamics.
Thank you. One last question, and then we're pretty much out of time. Are there practices like painting roofs white that could help reflect the heat back enough to make any difference, or is that of no consequence?
Well, I would say that things like that are probably very low consequence. You have to think of everything that we talk about doing, we have to be able to scale. And so I think there's 200 million rooftops in the US. And so you're talking about, right, just a huge number of roofs that you have to paint to do that. And by the way, the rooftop is only usually a small part of the land area, except for in cities. It's part of the reason that rooftop solar, while an important part of the picture, is limited in what it can provide, because there's just not, I mean, there's a lot of rooftop space, but even in aggregate, it's much smaller than the amount of land area. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to discourage anyone from doing everything they can to address the problem, but the key is to think about speed and scale. And doing that for all the rooftops in the world is an awfully daunting challenge.
It certainly is. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Leslie now. And
well, thank you, Robbie. I have to say the questions that have poured out from your 25 minutes have filled more than 30 minutes. And obviously you have really hit the trigger in our interest, and we look forward to getting that list from you. So thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with us tonight, to sort of share the perspective from on how we can transform the energy section of our economy. To you participants, I hope you enjoyed this webinar tonight, and I want to remind you that our next webinar is coming up on May 30th, and it will be our youth panel with youth from our Children's Trust, Zero Hour, the Climate Reporter, the Sunrise Movement, and I Matter. And it's going to be a fascinating roundtable discussion, hearing from that younger generation and the energy and focus they have on turning back climate change. If you enjoyed this webinar, and I hope you did, it would be wonderful if you would consider a small donation to Elders Climate Action. Our website is in the chat box that you can click on at the bottom of your screen. And we will be sending out a recording of this webinar tomorrow. I also want to end by saying that we will be having a gathering in Washington, D.C. in July 10th through the 12th. And we will be holding this with our partner, Moms Clean Air Force. And we will be working with Moms Clean Air Force to lobby as moms, dads, parents, grandparents, little kids, and elders. And then we will be having a gathering of Elders Climate Action members at the Capitol Visitor Center on Friday, July 12th. And sharing and building energy and excitement and hearing from some of our members of Congress. So thank you very much.